Poland has a long history of immigration to Belgium. In the early 20th century, many Polish people came to work in Belgian mines. They mostly settled in Wallonia. After the Second World War, the character of Polish immigration changed, including the refugees fleeing the war and the newly established communist regime. In the Cold War era, the influx of Poles was less important, involving the highly educated political refugees. After the fall of the Iron Curtain in 1989, a new wave of Polish migrants arrived to Belgium, including important number of short-term pendular migrants with illegal status. The accession of Poland to the European Union in 2004 triggered yet another wave of Polish movers to Belgium, this time mainly to Brussels. Among the newcomers, there were highly qualified, educated individuals, including the staff of the EU institutions, employees of EU matters-related organizations and undertakings, notably NGOs, law firms, lobbyists, diplomatic representations of various levels, but also students and researchers. In 2019, the number of Poles living in Belgium was estimated at around 71,331. However, according to other sources, there are in total as many as 100,000 up to even 120,000 Poles on the Belgian territory. Today, they constitute the sixth most numerous foreign population in Belgium. So, Polish people living in Belgium originate in several migratory movements. The Polish population in Belgium is quite heterogeneous and has consisted of different generations, different social classes, and come from different regions of Poland. In fact, they constitute distinct subgroups on the Belgian territory. Moreover, these subgroups do not really interact with each other except for service exchange-related occasions. Polish groups living in Belgium have also different degrees of organization. These may vary among subgroups, but also places. Apparently, the most organized Polish community is the one in Brussels. In this presentation, I will focus on Poles living in Brussels. Let us have a closer look at some of the aforementioned subgroups. The collapse of the communist regime enabled an important movement of Polish economic migrants to the West. At the beginning of the century, the migrants coming from northeast Poland and typically the region of Podlasie, mostly rural areas with scarce job opportunities, constituted the majority of the Poles working in Belgium. Undoubtedly, their movement was triggered by the prospects of better quality of life and higher incomes in the country of destination. They were usually sending an important part of their income back home to help their family members to invest in real estates or in local businesses back in Podlasie. In many cases, these people had poor job qualifications and little knowledge of the local languages and thus performed simple manual jobs. In the 90s, the Poles were allowed to stay only for 3 months on tourist visas, but they were not allowed to work in Belgium. As a result, they were forced to commuting back and forth and to work illegally. They constitute an example of pendular migrants, thus those constantly circulating between their country of origin and the host country. In the beginning, these were mostly single family members who were involved in this type of migration with an important proportion of women. They worked in shifts and were usually replaced by their relatives or friends from Poland. Some authors even suggested that they would later also sell their posts, hence recommended other workers against compensation from the latter. In this way, they created their own peculiar informal labor market. They usually maintained strong ties across borders. In fact, they were able to almost perfectly combine their professional activity in Belgium with family life in Poland. The Polish economic migrants overtook a certain niche in the Belgian informal labor market, notably cleaning, construction, and renovation sectors, and to a lesser extent also healthcare and seasonal work in agriculture. Even though the Poland's accession to the EU took place in 2004, the Belgian labor market opened to Poles only in May 2009. This was also the moment when many Poles could finally undertake the legal work activities. Most often, Polish economic migrants settled in poor districts of Brussels, such as Saint-Gilles, Schaerbeek, Anderlecht, and Saint-Just-en-Noode. Their social contacts were mostly restricted to the national group. This was due to the temporariness and illegality of their stay, the lack of language skills, and the self-sufficient character of this community. Several authors emphasize the role of the Polish Catholic Church for the undocumented Polish migrants living in Belgium. Attending a Polish Mass constituted an important aspect of life of the previous wave of Polish migrants. As Johann Lehmann observes, what these migrants sought in their church was the atmosphere of home or the native region. The Polish Church was an important driver of integration within the Polish community. Not only could the Poles in Brussels attend Sunday Mass in their maternal language, but they could also obtain assistance, legal advice, and moral support. The church was also the first destination for the newcomers where they could find important information, including possibilities of employment. It supported the Polish identity, helped to maintain the Polish culture, customs, and language, but also facilitated social life. The Polish Catholic Mission provided Polish children with schooling, had its own library and video rental. Moreover, it offered them free French courses, organized both religious and entertainment events. Thanks to the well-organized social networks, they were able to establish their own informal labor market and develop diverse commercial activities. These strong networks within the national community also helped them to facilitate the transfer of money, goods, and people across the borders. In fact, they created a self-sufficient little Poland in Belgium with a number of Polish shops, restaurants, several Polish schools, newspapers, or various cultural activities. They could feel at home abroad without real pressure to integrate with the local population. Nonetheless, such integration would be difficult while taking into account their mostly poor linguistic skills. On this slide, we can see a couple of Polish shops, there are plenty, as well as Polish restaurant and the Polish newspapers addressed to the Poles living in Belgium. In 2004, Poland joined the European Union. As from that moment, the Polish EU officials and EU matters related specialists start settling in Belgium, mostly Brussels. Contrary to the previous waves of Polish migrants, their movement is not triggered by joblessness or poverty, but rather by prospects of a rewarding career. This group of migrants is typically composed of highly skilled and well-paid professionals. Let me first say a few words about EU officials in general. In many respects, they are a unique group of Brussels inhabitants. Contrary to most of foreign population in Brussels, they are not economic migrants dependent on the Belgian labor market and Belgian welfare state institutions. Similarly to expatriates who are detached to an overseas branch of the company, they have not immigrated to Belgium as such. They have come to pursue the career in the institutions that happened to be located in this country. However, they are also different from most of the mobile, highly skilled professionals who typically come for a few years and subsequently leave to pursue their career in their home country or in another overseas branch. The EU officials typically come to Belgium to stay here for life or for an important part of their career. They constitute a non-negligible part of the Brussels population. In 2019, as many as 40,000 people were employed in the EU institutions, mainly in the Commission, but also in the European Parliament, the Council, and some other smaller institutions or executive agencies. According to the data available from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of the Republic of Poland, in 2013 there were 2,352 Poles employed in the EU institutions, 1,440 in the EU Commission, 395 in the EU Parliament, while 327 persons were employed in EU agencies. Although this number also includes those employed in Luxembourg, the majority lived and worked in Brussels. These numbers have remained quite stable. In 2019, the number of Poles employed in the Commission increased to 1,463. In the years following the arrival, the Polish EU officials were in a different position than their compatriots from Podlasie in the early 90s. Their employment was legal and stable. Their institutions largely took care of the regularization of their stay, intermediating contacts with the Belgian administration. Still, they needed to cope with finding accommodation and daily life practicalities such as opening a bank account, finding groceries and restaurants, and re-establishing their social network. Importantly, the role of the Catholic Church with this regard was insignificant. Instead of turning to the Polish Church, the newcomers chose to engage in intensive social networking within the Polish EU officials' circle. They founded several virtual groups. Most importantly, the online forum in one of the main Polish newspapers and the institution's internal mailing group EPS, from EPSO, the European Personnel Selection Office. These virtual groups and fora played a major role in mutual advice and information exchange. They also met regularly, once per month, and socialized in designated places in the European district in Brussels. First at the Chez Bernard in Place Jourdain, then in the Old Oak at Rue Franklin, at the Wild Geese pub, finally in the Aloft bar. The life of Polish EU officials differs from a typical pattern described by the scholars as regards the EU officials from the pre-enlargement Union. EU officials typically live in certain middle or upper middle class districts of Brussels, such as Woluwe-Saint-Pierre, Woluwe-Saint-Lambert, Oderghem, or Watermile-Boisfort. This is because newcomers evolve predominantly within the environment of the already settled EU officials, since they come to Brussels. They follow their advice and seek to settle in their neighborhood. However, this phenomenon of special seclusion in expat enclaves in Brussels initially did not take place in case of the Polish EU officials. They were more dispersed, settling either in proximity to the institutions, Brussels, Etterbeek, or even Saint-Josse, or in young, lively municipalities such as Ixelles. However, after a few years, they started to move to the more affluent districts following family changes. Polish EU officials are generally English speakers. As French is one of the Commission working languages and its command is strongly encouraged by the institution, they typically learn French and find important to do it. By contrast, only very few persons found it important to or actually did learn Dutch, as this language is not perceived as necessary for successful adaptation. Intensive socialization within their own group resulted in quick establishment of the Polish EU community. Nowadays, however, they have progressively expanded their social activity to cover other EU officials and expatriates, not only Poles. Belgians are much less visible from the perspective of EU officials, as their respective words hardly ever intersect. EU officials, unlike ethnic minorities, do not even belong to the local labour market and have less to do with Belgian administration. Their identity card is applied for and delivered via the institutions, and they don't pay income taxes in Belgium. They usually have neutral attitudes to other ethnic communities in Brussels, although sometimes it happens to be negative. In any case, for most of Polish EU officials, contact with local people typically takes place in the context of buying goods and services. In the same time, they feel they are subject to stereotypes and exclusionary practices by the host society. The Polish EU officials are not a fully homogeneous group as regards their attitude to integration in Brussels. Typically, they do not seem interested in integration in the Belgian society. Such integration is often perceived as unnecessary and useless. They see Belgians relatively seldom. They do not even perceive Brussels as fully or even predominantly Belgian because of its multicultural character. On the other hand, they see no interest in integration with the ethnic Polish population of Brussels. In fact, as they function smoothly in the city, they feel no pressure for integration with any local group. By contrast, they are tightening ties with other EU officials or expats, not necessarily of Polish origin. They perceive EU officials as a distinct group and had developed a strong professional identification. This selective integration in the city has its drawbacks. Despite their important number, EU officials have little influence on the Brussels reality. Polish EU officials are rarely interested in public matters concerning Brussels. They hardly ever vote in local elections. In the same time, most of Polish EU officials have no adaptation problems. The common European cultural background is sufficient to function smoothly in the city, especially within the group of other EU officials and expats. For the same reason, they feel no need to specifically adapt to the Belgian culture. Again, many of them perceive Brussels as a place without local culture, emphasizing the international pluricultural character of the city. The only difficulty as concerns the cultural integration of EU officials within larger Brussels beyond the Eurobubble is the language, as some of them are still predominantly Anglophone. Culturally speaking, Polish EU officials remain attached to Polish traditions and practices concerning food, language, and so on. However, they are able to smoothly function in the new environment and are culturally adapted to the host society. They travel regularly to Poland, spend Easter and Christmas in Poland, maintain contact with their families, remain interested in the Polish news and events, and seek regular access to Polish culture. However, contrary to the economic migrants, they are not trying to create Little Poland in Belgium. They may buy Polish goods or services, but rather selectively and occasionally. They usually frequent the same bars or restaurants as other expats or Belgians instead of concentrating on Polish events or parties. Over time and with new routines, their lifestyles have accommodated elements brought by new cultural experiences and perspectives. In the same time, many of them stopped following the public life in Poland and have grown distant from their friends and relatives in Poland. In general, they remain strongly linked to their institutions and colleagues. This is certainly due to the so-called phenomenon of engrenage and related to intensive socialization at work, common interest, and work-induced similar ways of thinking. In addition to what they have in common, They also actively build boundaries separating them from other groups, notably from the majority of Polish people in Brussels and from Belgians. They need to separate themselves from the former to maintain their higher social status. The boundary separating them from Belgians is a response to the perceived rejection and stereotypization by the latter, both as Poles and as EU officials.